December 23, 1944. The chill of the Philippine dawn clung to the hills around Ormoc Bay like a living thing. Smoke curled from shattered palm groves. American machine gun fire crackled and fell silent, leaving only the hiss of the tide and the groans of men dragged from foxholes. On a slope scarred with shell craters, a group of Japanese soldiers stumbled under guard, hands bound, eyes hollow from hunger and exhaustion. Their uniforms hung in tatters. Their faces bore the rigid mask of men taught to die rather than surrender. Yet they were still alive, trembling as American GIs approached. The prisoners expected the butt of a rifle, a blade, or worse. Instead, something extraordinary unfolded in the gray light. A sergeant reached into his rucksack, pulled out a dented can of Lucky Lager, and wordlessly held it out. Another GI flicked open a pack of Camel cigarettes and gestured to the stunned captives. The Japanese stared in disbelief, an unthinkable gesture in the code of their war. The jungle around them smelled of damp earth and cordite. Palm leaves dripped like rain as distant artillery boomed. Even here, on a forgotten corner of the Pacific Front, the collision of two civilizations was playing out in miniature. The Japanese, schooled from youth in Bushido's stern creed, surrender equals shame, capture equals dishonor, now found themselves face to face with Americans who defied every expectation. They had been taught that capture meant torture or execution, that Allied soldiers were beasts without mercy. Yet here were their enemies, offering them a drink and a smoke, as if the war itself had paused for a flicker of humanity. For a heartbeat, the bayonets lowered, the rifles slung, and the smell of beer mingled with salt air. Months of fighting had led to this moment. The Americans were exhausted too. Many had lost friends in Banza charges and had seen night assaults that left fields strewn with bodies. Yet their doctrine, drilled from North Africa to Normandy, emphasized discipline and control. A prisoner was to be disarmed, searched, and processed, not brutalized. For the U.S. Army, such treatment was not a sign of weakness, but of order. The GI's new propaganda painted them as monsters. They responded with casual, almost defiant generosity. The war still raged, but the ethos of an industrial democracy, with its belief in rules and rights, bled into the foxholes and prisoner cages of the Pacific. The Japanese prisoners barely moved as the beer cans were passed. Some took them with shaking hands, glancing from the liquid to the Americans' impassive faces. Others could not bring themselves to drink, certain a trick lay within. A corporal lit a cigarette for one captive, the flame of his Zippo dancing in the wind. Smoke rose between men who had tried to kill each other hours earlier. This tableau, beer, cigarettes, and a shared silence, became a memory etched into the minds of the prisoners who survived. Years later, in memoirs and interviews, many would recount that moment as the first crack in the wall of indoctrination that had walled off their humanity during the war. Beyond this isolated beachhead, the broader Pacific campaign churned with brutality. From Tarawa to Saipan, the pattern had been the same. Japanese soldiers fought to the last, civilians jumped from cliffs, and Americans learned to expect no surrender. When surrenders did occur, they were often met with suspicion or fire, both sides convinced the other was baiting a trap. By late 1944, however, cracks were appearing. Starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment were eroding the Imperial Army's resolve. More and more soldiers, especially conscripts and support troops, were laying down their arms. Yet their expectations remained unchanged: death in a prisoner cage or a slow torment. The behavior of American soldiers, unsentimental but oddly respectful, shocked them to the core. Back on the ridge above Ormoc, an officer with a clipboard took names, scribbling in block letters while interpreters struggled with dialects. The prisoners sat in rows, clutching their beer cans like lifelines, eyes darting at the guards. Behind them, jeeps rolled up with red cross-marked water cans. In the distance, the sound of P-38s screamed over the bay, strafing retreating barges. This was still war, but the rituals of processing captured men unfolded with bureaucratic precision. When one prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, an American medic knelt beside him, checking his pulse. The Japanese soldiers exchanged bewildered looks. Even wounded enemies were treated, a concept so alien to their indoctrination that some believed it a psychological trick designed to extract secrets. The scene could have come from another planet compared to the Eastern Front or Nanking. The American Army, drawn from a melting pot of farm boys, factory workers, and college students, carried with it habits of sharing, joking, and consumption. Beer and cigarettes were not just rations, they were culture distilled. To offer them to a prisoner was at once a gesture of dominance and of humanity, a way of saying, "We have enough to share, and we are not afraid of you." It underlined a larger truth about the United States at war. The immense logistical machine behind every GI meant abundance, and abundance meant magnanimity. Night fell swiftly in the tropics. Lanterns flickered in the makeshift POW compound as the prisoners were marched inside. Some still clutched their cigarette stubs as though proof the moment had been real. The Americans posted sentries, cleaned their rifles, and sat down to their own meager dinners. In their tents, they wrote letters home describing the fight, sometimes mentioning the strange quiet after the battle and the equally strange sight of Japanese soldiers sipping American beer. They knew this was not how the war was usually fought. Tomorrow the killing would resume. But for now, there had been a moment of recognition, man to man. For the Japanese prisoners, the shock would deepen in the days ahead. They would receive medical care, food, and treatment according to the Geneva Conventions, terms they had been told did not apply in the Pacific. When interviewed months later, many would recall their first taste of American beer or their first smoke from an American cigarette as the instant they realized their captors were not demons, but men. This realization did not erase the war's savagery, but it planted a seed that would grow in post-war years, when these same men would return to a devastated homeland and try to reconcile their wartime beliefs with the reality they had experienced. Out in the bay, the tide rose and fell, erasing the footprints of the battle. The palm groves whispered with wind, and the night insects sang. Somewhere, deep in the compound, a Japanese soldier exhaled a cloud of cigarette smoke and stared at the stars, thinking of home. The beer can lay empty beside him, glinting in the moonlight. A trivial object, yet freighted with meaning. It had been handed to him not as charity, but as a message he would carry long after the war ended, that even in the heart of conflict, the enemy could act with an unexpected humanity. And that single gesture, small as it seemed, carried more shock than any bombardment. By late 1944, the Pacific War had reached a fever pitch of exhaustion and brutality. 3 years of island hopping had pushed American forces closer to the Japanese homeland, while the Imperial Army bled itself dry trying to defend every outpost. The Philippines, once a jewel of American possession and Japanese conquest, became the pivot point. General Douglas MacArthur's long-promised return was underway, and with it came the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific theater. Japanese soldiers, marooned on isolated islands, found themselves cut off from supply lines, low on food, and haunted by malaria. For the first time, the Imperial Army's unyielding doctrine faced an adversary not only superior in numbers and technology, but also relentless in logistics and morale. The Philippines campaign illustrated this collision. American troops had learned bitter lessons from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Polillo. They landed with heavier artillery, better coordination, and a hardened understanding of Japanese tactics. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers, drilled since childhood to die rather than surrender, were beginning to see the futility of their stand. Letters intercepted by U.S. intelligence spoke of hunger, disease, and doubts creeping into the ranks. Yet surrender remained taboo. Propaganda from Tokyo depicted Americans as sadistic killers, and even minor disciplinary violations could result in execution by one's own officers. It was a system designed to crush individuality and force collective sacrifice, the antithesis of the American soldier's ethos. Across the Pacific, the American military machine had grown into an organism of staggering scale. By the time the Leyte and Ormoc Bay battles unfolded, U.S. forces could call upon swarms of landing craft, fleets of escort carriers, and a logistical tail stretching back across the entire Pacific. Millions of tons of supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, food, beer, and cigarettes moved through this pipeline. These weren't trivial comforts. They were symbols of an economy and a society mobilized to a degree Japan could never match. When U.S. soldiers offered cigarettes to prisoners, It was not only kindness, but also an unconscious display of this abundance. They had enough to spare even for the enemy. Japanese command structures, by contrast, were fraying. Officers who had survived the China War and the early triumphs of 1941 to 42 now commanded skeleton units. The proud divisions that had stormed Malaya and Bataan were hollow shells. Disease and attrition had whittled down the ranks, and replacements were often teenage conscripts or pressed laborers from Korea and Taiwan. They carried antiquated rifles and homemade grenades, and many lacked boots. Yet their training manuals still preached the same warrior code: absolute loyalty, no surrender, and contempt for the soft Americans. This tension between ideology and reality produced desperate behavior: mass banzai charges, suicidal night raids, and occasional mass surrenders only when hope was utterly gone. In Washington and Honolulu, Allied planners noted this shift with grim calculation. Intelligence reports from codebreakers and frontline interrogations revealed a growing pool of Japanese prisoners. Although still tiny compared to German POW numbers, each captured soldier represented a crack in the imperial facade. Psychologists and military analysts studied them, trying to understand the enemy mindset. Could indoctrination be broken? Could humane treatment of prisoners undermine Japanese morale? The answer, slowly, was yes. Memoirs from captured soldiers decades later described how their first encounters with American captors challenged every belief they held about the war. On the ground in the Philippines, this broader strategy translated into strict orders. Units were instructed to take prisoners whenever possible and to treat them according to the Geneva Conventions, even though Japan itself was not a signatory. American commanders believed discipline and decency served their own troops' morale and the larger war effort. The more Japanese soldiers surrendered, the fewer Americans would die storming bunkers. And the image of American fairness could be weaponized as psychological warfare against an enemy steeped in fear and propaganda. The landscape of the campaign amplified these contradictions. The Philippines' jungles and mountains were treacherous, choked with foliage, humidity, and insects. Combat was intimate and brutal. Ambushes unfolded at 20 yards, artillery thundered in hills carved with caves, and air raids shredded supply lines. Yet amid this grinding attrition, the American military erected order. Field hospitals under canvas, supply dumps stacked like small towns, and even impromptu movie screenings for troops. This ability to create normality in chaos reflected the industrial might behind the GI, a society that could fight a global war and still send beer and cigarettes thousands of miles to the front line. Meanwhile, the Imperial Japanese Army clung to its rituals. Soldiers bowed before battle, tied on white headbands, and carried flags inscribed with prayers. Death was not only expected but embraced as a final act of loyalty. When capture became inevitable, many committed suicide rather than risk the unknown of Allied custody. This cultural chasm explained the stunned expressions of those who survived to be taken prisoner. They had been promised only death, yet found rations and medical care instead. This was not to romanticize American behavior. Instances of brutality and summary executions occurred on both sides, especially in the war's earliest years when surrender traps were common. But by late 1944, discipline and doctrine had solidified. U.S. units understood the intelligence value of live prisoners. They also recognized the propaganda opportunity of showing humanity. While Japanese troops remained bound to the Bushido Code, American forces increasingly fought a war of information as much as of bullets. The scale of the Pacific Theater dwarfed anything most Americans had imagined in 1941. Entire divisions vanished into the green maze of Luzon's mountains, while offshore fleets stretched beyond the horizon. Each battle formed a mosaic of individual encounters, like the one on the slopes of Ormoc Bay, that collectively shifted the war's psychology. Each cigarette handed to a prisoner undermined years of Tokyo's propaganda. Each can of beer suggested a world beyond hunger and obedience. These were not just tokens. They were cracks in the edifice of an empire by the end of 1944. As the tide of war moved inexorably toward Japan's home islands, the stories of captured soldiers began filtering back to Tokyo. Despite censorship, rumors spread among troops. Americans feed their prisoners. Americans do not torture them. Americans share their rations. Such whispers eroded morale, making future surrenders more likely. The system designed to ensure death over capture began to falter, one gesture at a time, in this broader historical context. That single moment of beer and cigarettes on a Philippine hillside takes on new weight. It was not merely a quirk of individual kindness, but the manifestation of a strategic reality. The United States could afford to fight with both power and restraint. The Japanese Empire, starved of resources and locked into an ideology of death, could not. That imbalance, material, psychological, and moral, foreshadowed the final collapse to come. The secret was not written in bold letters on any American field manual, nor did it arrive with the thunder of battleships. It was a quiet, almost invisible advantage, flowing through wires and signals, discipline and doctrine. While Japanese soldiers clutched tightly to their rifles and their Bushido vows, American GIs carried something just as powerful, a culture of abundance, logistics, and communication. Beer and cigarettes were only the surface of this hidden edge. Beneath them lay a vast machine of supply chains, troop welfare policies, and psychological operations. The Japanese prisoners who tasted that first sip of American beer were in fact tasting the output of an entire war economy designed not just to kill, but to sustain. From the earliest days of the Pacific War, U.S. planners had grasped a critical truth: morale was a weapon. It had to be forged and maintained like steel. A soldier who believed he was valued, who had his mail delivered, his pay sent home, his meals regular, and his rations dependable, would fight longer and with steadier hands. This was why, even at the farthest island outposts, the U.S. Army and Navy worked relentlessly to deliver comforts as well as ammunition. Cigarettes came in sealed cartons, beer in small cans specially designed for the tropics, and chocolate bars in foil that could withstand heat. These were not luxuries. They were ammunition for the mind. The Japanese Army, by contrast, treated its men as expendable resources, drilled to accept starvation and deprivation as virtues. When cut off, they ate roots and worms or went without entirely. This difference was not just about industrial capacity, but about worldview. The American soldier was a citizen first, a combatant second, and entitled to certain expectations. The Japanese soldier was an instrument of the emperor's will, taught that need and suffering purified the spirit. Thus, when captured, Japanese soldiers were confronted by an almost surreal inversion of their training. Here was an enemy who believed a man at war still deserved a smoke, a drink, and medical care. It was not just kindness. It was a revelation of power. Hidden in this contrast was also the quiet revolution of communication. American units from platoon to corps were wired, radioed, and connected in ways the Imperial Japanese Army could barely fathom. The same system that allowed a sergeant in Ormoc Bay to request supplies and reinforcements also allowed him to requisition comfort items. The SCR series radios, FM channels, and disciplined signal protocols formed an invisible web over the battlefield. Japanese units, often cut off with antiquated or absent radios, operated as isolated fragments. They relied on runners, flags, or pre-planned orders. When the situation shifted, they were stranded in silence. This difference in connection would decide countless skirmishes and also shape the way prisoners were handled. Americans could coordinate prisoner processing with rear echelons. Japanese units rarely even had a plan for capture. The Gi's informal generosity, sharing beer and cigarettes, thus became an extension of their official logistical superiority. It was a statement that the system was so robust it could afford humanity. It was also a weapon of psychological warfare. Interrogators and civil affairs officers noted how quickly Japanese prisoners' attitudes shifted once they were fed, clothed, and treated with dignity. Information flowed more easily. Rumors of humane treatment spread back to Japanese lines. Each can of beer, each cigarette, was an arrow in the quiver of soft power. Many of the prisoners later testified to a second shock after their capture: the systematic nature of American intelligence. They were fingerprinted, interviewed, and cataloged with bureaucratic precision. Some were astounded to see their own names, ranks, and units already known. This omniscience, built from decrypted communications and captured documents, reinforced the aura of an enemy both materially superior and eerily well-informed. Against this backdrop, the small gestures of kindness stood out all the more. To a Japanese soldier raised on stories of Western barbarity, the cigarette extended by a grinning GI was a paradox. How could a foe both so powerful and so informed also be so casually humane? Behind the front lines, the U.S. Army had invested in training its men not only to fight, but also to manage prisoners. Field manuals stressed discipline, no fraternization beyond controlled measures, and adherence to the Geneva Conventions. Yet soldiers, being human, brought their own habits. They remembered the Great Depression, their own immigrant parents, their union jobs, their ball games, and their bars back home. For them, a cigarette or a beer was as natural as breathing. Offering one to a prisoner was not a political act, but an instinctive leveling gesture, a way of saying, without words, that both were men far from home. Japanese doctrine provided no equivalent. To surrender was to be an outcast. To be captured was to become less than human. This dehumanization created a psychic shock when confronted with American captors who acted otherwise. In that moment of shock lay opportunity. Military psychologists later compared it to a sudden decompression, where a rigid worldview collapses under contradictory evidence. The GIs may not have known the term, but they enacted it every time they offered a prisoner a smoke. As 1945 approached, this hidden advantage would only grow. American supply ships became floating cities, offloading everything from tanks to ice cream machines. Units moved forward with mobile laundries, cinemas, and chaplains. Japanese soldiers, huddled in caves, could hear the generators and music drifting from enemy camps at night. They could smell coffee, bacon, and tobacco on the wind. The psychological gap widened daily. In a war where the enemy had been dehumanized on both sides, these sensory signals carried as much weight as leaflets or radio broadcasts. They whispered a dangerous message: your leaders have lied to you. The Americans are not monsters. The symbolism of beer and cigarettes thus transcended their physical form. They were the emissaries of a different way of waging war, one that combined overwhelming firepower with a calculated cultivation of morale, both for one's own troops and for the enemy's. The Japanese POW who took a tentative sip from an American can was doing more than quenching thirst. He was tasting the industrial democracy that had built it, the shipping lanes that had carried it, and the doctrine that had allowed it to reach him intact on a distant island. It was as alien to his experience as the concept of surrender itself that in this way, what seemed like a small act on a forgotten battlefield in the Philippines reflected a larger hidden advantage. America's war machine was not only producing weapons, but also manufacturing moments of cognitive dissonance that weakened the enemy's will. Beer and cigarettes, radios and rations, discipline and decency. Together they formed an arsenal less visible than a battleship, but just as decisive. For the Japanese soldier who had been told Americans would kill him on sight, the greatest shock was not capture. It was kindness. It began with an unassuming rectangle of steel, bakelite knobs, and a whip antenna that rose like an insect's stinger over the turret of an American tank. To the untrained eye, it was merely another piece of gear, but to the men who used it, it was the nervous system of the U.S. Army. The SCR 508 radio, humming with frequency-modulated clarity, allowed American armored units to coordinate movements with a precision that the Imperial Japanese Army could scarcely imagine. In the steaming jungles of the Philippines, where sightlines vanished into green curtains and the enemy could be 20 yards or 2 miles away, that ability to speak, instantly, securely, across distance, was as decisive as any gun or shell. Frequency modulation was the invisible revolution of this war. Where Japanese radios sputtered with static, bled into civilian bands, or failed entirely in humid conditions, American sets cut through with crisp, disciplined signals. At 27.1 to 38.9 megacycles, with 25 watts of power and crystal-controlled stability, the SCR 508 could talk tank to tank, platoon to company, and company to division. Its squat, olive drab casing contained 2,748 components, every one soldered and tested back in Chicago or Detroit. Motorola and Galvin Manufacturing churned them out by the tens of thousands, shipping them westward in endless convoys. The result was not just better radios, but a battlefield network. Orders could be relayed in seconds. Artillery fire adjusted before the first salvo landed. evacuation of wounded coordinated under fire. Even the logistics of POW handling, trucks, medics, MPs, could be summoned without guesswork. By contrast, the Imperial Japanese Army clung to older, amplitude-modulated sets or field telephones vulnerable to every whim of weather and terrain. Many infantry units possessed no radios at all. Messages went by runner or flag. In the Philippines' labyrinth of hills and gulches, that meant isolation, fragmentation, and a fatal lag between order and execution. The same cultural factors that made Japanese units fight with ferocity also prevented decentralized communication. Officers issued elaborate plans. Enlisted men executed them blindly, unable to adjust once the plan collided with reality. This rigidity magnified the impact of American flexibility. A platoon sergeant with an FM radio could call down steel from a destroyer 5 miles offshore before the enemy even realized he had been spotted. This technical edge extended beyond communications. American tanks and trucks ran on standardized parts, built in factories that could produce thousands a week. Spare components flowed from supply depots like water. Jeeps carried mobile signal repair kits. Field manuals taught GIs to swap tubes and check frequencies under fire. The Japanese, starved of resources, scavenged batteries and cannibalized sets to keep a handful working. Their transmitters flickered and died under tropical humidity. Each failed radio deepened the silence around a Japanese platoon. Each successful transmission strengthened the American net. It was the same with logistics. Beer and cigarettes, the tokens of an empire of supply, arrived in neat boxes labeled with quartermaster codes. Every GI knew he would get his rations, his mail, his medical check, and his replacement weapon if one broke. This reliability bred confidence and the capacity for restraint. A soldier who trusted his system did not need to hoard cruelty or rage as armor. He could afford, literally, to be generous. For the Japanese soldier, raised in scarcity and surrounded by collapse, generosity from an enemy felt like a hallucination. In the motor pools behind the front lines, engineers worked under floodlights to keep the flow going. Generators hummed. Typewriters clacked. Teleprinters spat out orders. This was the hidden battlefield of circuit diagrams and supply tables, where victory was built as surely as on any ridge. The Japanese had their own engineers, brilliant and dedicated, but they labored under shortages so severe they were forced to substitute bamboo for metal and send radios into combat without waterproofing. The industrial base of an island empire could not match the continental output of a mobilized democracy. The technical disparity showed itself in small but telling ways. American medics carried morphine syrettes with precise dosages. Japanese medics often lacked even sulfa powder. American trucks hauled prefabricated bridges to span ravines. Japanese soldiers built theirs from local timber. American field kitchens served hot meals in shifts. Japanese troops boiled rice in helmets. These differences were not mere conveniences. They were a force multiplier. They allowed U.S. units to stay longer in the field, recover faster, and project not just fire, but an entire ecosystem of support. All of this fed into the psychological shock of capture. When Japanese soldiers were marched into a POW cage and saw racks of radios, neat rows of trucks, crates of rations, and soldiers chatting casually with headquarters thousands of miles away, they glimpsed a war machine of almost alien coherence. The beer and cigarettes were only the first layer. Behind them lay the humming heart of a networked army, an army that could see, move, and act as one organism. In interviews decades later, former POWs often described their first impression not of the weapons, but of the organization. Everything labeled, everything working, everyone knowing their place. The SCR 508 was emblematic, but not alone. The SCR 300 walkie-talkie, the N/PR cherries, and the Signal Corps' massive switchboards each formed a node in a lattice of command and control. This was the embryonic form of what would later be called network-centric warfare. Orders flowed like electricity, information like blood. It was a doctrine born of engineers and logisticians as much as of generals. In the Philippines, where rain turned roads to rivers and trees swallowed entire battalions, it gave the Americans the edge they needed to cut through fog and foliage alike. Even in the dim glow of a tent lantern, A radio operator hunched over his set, headphones pressed to his ears, pencil scrawling coordinates. Outside, jeeps rumbled and MPs herded prisoners. The sound of a beer can popping open mingled with the static hiss of a secure channel. This was the unseen world beneath the firefights, the cables, antennas, warehouses, and mines that made modern war something more than brute force. It was the quiet, technical miracle that allowed a sergeant on a far-flung hill to summon not only artillery, but also humanity in the end. The technical deep dive reveals that the gesture of offering a cigarette was never isolated. It was connected to the entire architecture of American power, radios whispering across miles, factories humming in the Midwest, ships plowing the Pacific with holds full of both shells and comforts. Against that, the Imperial Japanese Army stood with gallantry but also with silence. And in war, silence can be fatal. The Japanese prisoners at Ormoc Bay did not know the names of the components inside the SCR-508 or the shipping routes behind their captors' supplies. But they felt the effect. They felt it in the efficiency of their capture, in the paradox of their treatment, and in the strange, metallic taste of beer under a tropical sky, the flavor of an entire system working. Unseen but unstoppable, September 19, 1944. Dawn broke over the low, rolling fields near Aracourt, France, with a damp mist that clung to every hedgerow and ditch. The ground trembled under the approach of heavy armor. 39 German Panthers, their dark silhouettes like predators in the fog, crept forward with disciplined precision. Their commanders believed they were about to crush another American screening force. Instead, they were entering an arena unlike anything they had seen on the Eastern Front, an arena where speed, coordination, and invisible signals would undo them. This battle, fought thousands of miles from the Pacific, echoed the same dynamics that would shape Ormoc Bay, the collision between Japanese-style rigidity and the American mastery of communications, logistics, and adaptability. The 4th Armored Division of Patton's 3rd Army lay hidden behind low rises and patches of forest. Their M18 Hellcats crouched like coiled animals, crews whispering over FM radios. At 0700 hours, a burst of static cleared, and then a calm voice delivered coordinates. Turrets swiveled. Diesel engines rumbled. What the Germans could not see was the lattice of signals connecting every American unit on the field. Each tank destroyer knew its neighbor's position. Artillery batteries miles away stood ready to fire at a moment's notice. This was the battlefield the SCR-508 and its kin had built, and it was about to spring shut. The first Panthers crested a rise and were met by a thunderclap of armor-piercing rounds. Muzzle flashes flared in the mist. German gunners swung their turrets, but found only fleeting silhouettes. Hellcats darting from cover to cover, disappearing before the Panthers could return fire. The American crews operated like chess players moving on a board they alone could see. Over the airwaves, coordinates, range calls, and fire orders flickered like an electric current. The Panthers, bound to line-of-sight tactics and slow relay chains, lumbered forward blind. Within minutes, the battlefield became a storm of fire and movement. M18s shifted positions after every shot, their commanders adjusting on the fly with real-time information. Artillery observers, crouched in church towers and hedgerows, called down barrages with uncanny precision. In Patton's doctrine, initiative flowed downward. Sergeants could act without waiting for permission, trusting their radios to keep the whole force in sync. This was not just technology, but a philosophy. Where the Germans and Japanese adhered to prearranged plans, the Americans embraced improvisation supported by instant communication. By midday, the German assault had unraveled. Smoke billowed from wrecked Panthers, their armor pierced by coordinated flanking shots. Survivors retreated in disarray, leaving behind burning hulks and dazed infantry. American losses were comparatively light. After-action reports from German commanders expressed astonishment at the speed and fluidity of the American defense. They had expected a static fight and found themselves up against a moving, talking, thinking opponent. Although Aracourt lay in Europe, its lessons reverberated across the Pacific. The same principles applied at Ormoc Bay, Leyte, and countless unnamed ridges in the Philippines. American units, wired together by radios and supply chains, could spring traps, shift forces, and exploit weaknesses in real time. Japanese defenders, like the German tank crews at Aracourt, often found themselves fighting ghosts, enemies who appeared, struck, and vanished. When capture occurred, it too unfolded with mechanical precision. Prisoners were processed, interrogated, and cared for not as an afterthought, but as part of a system. Back in the Pacific, December 1944 mirrored that European lesson in its own way. At Ormoc Bay, American troops advanced under the same invisible canopy of coordination, landing craft timed to the minute. Artillery synchronized with airstrikes. Medics and MPs prepared to receive wounded and prisoners even before the battle began. The Japanese defenders, starving and cut off, mounted brave but futile counterattacks. They had no radios linking platoons, no steady flow of ammunition, and no plan for surrender. When pockets collapsed, they collapsed completely. Those who survived stumbled into American custody as if stepping into another world. One American officer later described the effect on prisoners. They'd look at the organization behind us and just go silent. We'd have tents, trucks, field kitchens, radios buzzing, everything labeled, everything on time. They couldn't believe it. Another GI remembered offering a cigarette to a captured Japanese sergeant and seeing his hands shake violently, not from withdrawal but from disbelief. These were the same hands that had clutched a rifle hours before. Now they held a gift from the enemy, a token of a system so alien it felt like sorcery. Aracourt also highlighted the doctrine of speed as survival. The M18 Hellcat's thin armor and 55 miles per hour top speed embodied an American willingness to trade protection for agility. In the Pacific, though terrain replaced open fields, the principle was similar. Move faster than the enemy can react, coordinate through radios, and strike at weak points. Whether in French farmlands or Philippine jungles, the pattern repeated. When capture occurred, it often followed swift encirclement rather than prolonged siege. This minimized bloodshed on both sides and increased the chance of prisoners surviving to experience American treatment. The psychological impact of such battles cannot be overstated. German tankers at Aracourt wrote of being hunted by phantoms they could not see. Japanese soldiers on Leyte spoke of Americans who knew where we were before we moved. This perception of omnipresence, born from radio coordination, reconnaissance, and logistics, eroded morale. Surrender, once unthinkable, began to seem a lesser fate than annihilation. And when surrender led not to execution but to beer and cigarettes, the cognitive dissonance deepened on the American side. These battles reinforced confidence in their system. A GI who saw a prisoner treated decently internalized that his own life, should he be captured, might also have value. It was a feedback loop of discipline and humanity. While atrocities did occur, war could brutalize anyone. The prevailing doctrine tilted toward order. That order drew strength from technology, training, and a belief in democratic values projected into combat zones. As the smoke cleared over Aracourt, with wrecked Panthers cooling in the drizzle and Hellcat crews tallying their shots, the broader lesson was visible even to a casual observer. A well-supplied, well-connected force could outmaneuver a theoretically superior foe. The same lesson, transposed to the Pacific, played out in microcosm when Japanese POWs encountered American abundance. Each beer can handed to a prisoner echoed the FM radio signals that had guided tanks to victory. Each cigarette mirrored the logistical arteries pumping from Midwestern factories to tropical beaches. In the years after the war, military historians would cite Aracourt as a model of network defense. But its spirit lived also in the Pacific POW cages, in the orderly rows of tents, the hum of generators, and the discipline of guards who nevertheless handed out smokes. War's essence, destruction, had met its counterpoint, a system designed not only to destroy but also to absorb, to process, and even to humanize. For the Japanese prisoners who survived Ormoc Bay, that system was as incomprehensible as the fast-striking Hellcats had been to German tankers at Aracourt. And like those tankers, they would never forget the moment they realized their enemy was not only deadly, but also connected, disciplined, and oddly humane. By early 1945, the shockwaves of these encounters were rippling far beyond the palm groves of the Philippines or the hedgerows of France. What had begun as isolated incidents, a can of beer, a cigarette, a medic bending over a wounded enemy, was revealing itself as a quiet force reshaping the war's psychological terrain. Japanese troops, long convinced that capture meant torture and death, now carried whispered stories of American captors who offered food, treatment, and even small kindnesses. These tales, drifting through foxholes and caves, cracked the monolith of Imperial Army indoctrination. Just as radios and logistics had given the Americans physical dominance, their discipline and humanity were creating an invisible battlefield of the mind, strategically. This mattered because the Pacific War was as much a struggle of endurance as of firepower. Every Japanese soldier who surrendered rather than fought to the death saved American lives, freed up resources, and accelerated the collapse of outposts. Every prisoner processed became a living message sent back to the imperial ranks. Surrender does not equal annihilation. U.S. military psychologists understood the leverage. Field pamphlets stressed consistent treatment of prisoners, while interrogation units compiled data on cultural taboos, hoping to exploit them without brutality. The goal was not benevolence for its own sake, but a calculated undermining of enemy morale. This approach fed into a larger narrative of control. The American war machine was demonstrating not just that it could conquer, but that it could manage. Its ability to feed, transport, and communicate with millions of men extended to handling thousands of captives with order and predictability. For the Japanese soldier, whose own army often failed to resupply him with rice or medicine, this orderliness was bewildering. It inverted the power dynamic they had been taught. The Americans were not barbarians, but engineers of a total war environment, able to apply the same precision to a POW cage as to an artillery barrage. The psychological toll on the Japanese side was severe. Soldiers steeped in the Bushido ethos faced a crisis of identity upon capture. They had been prepared for death, not for the humiliation of being fed by an enemy. Yet the humiliation was complicated by gratitude and relief. Diaries recovered from prison camps years later spoke of the unbearable kindness and a strange shame at surviving. Some prisoners tried to reconcile these feelings by framing their captors as tricksters. Others embraced the new reality with stunned acceptance. Either way, the seed of doubt planted by humane treatment began eroding the will to resist among troops still in the field. Among American soldiers, the effect was subtler but no less important. War's brutality could erode discipline quickly. In the early Pacific campaigns, the ferocity of Japanese resistance had led to atrocities on both sides, with few prisoners taken and little mercy shown. But as the war progressed and American logistical and communication systems matured, the Army could enforce stricter control. Beer and cigarettes were more than just morale boosters for prisoners. They were symbols of a disciplined force confident enough to act predictably. A soldier who believed his army stood for something larger than vengeance fought differently, carrying a sense of mission rather than bloodlust. The interplay between connection and isolation also shaped command dynamics. American officers could reassign leadership on the fly via radio if a commander fell. Japanese units, severed from communication, often collapsed once their officers were killed. This difference magnified the psychological impact of American operations. Japanese survivors described feeling encircled by an invisible net, convinced the Americans were everywhere at once. When capture came and the net proved to include medical care and rations, the cognitive dissonance deepened. This was not the faceless monster of propaganda, but a disciplined network of men who could both annihilate and accommodate on a strategic level. The humane treatment of prisoners also served post-war aims. Washington planners, already thinking ahead to occupation and reconstruction, wanted to plant seeds of goodwill where possible. Every Japanese soldier who experienced fair treatment might become a post-war advocate for cooperation rather than resistance. This was speculative, but in practice it worked. Decades later, many former POWs would recount their surprise at American behavior as the first crack in their ideological armor, a crack that later allowed them to embrace new alliances during the Cold War era. None of this negated the violence of the Pacific theater. Battles like Okinawa and Iwo Jima would still exact ghastly tolls. Kamikaze attacks, mass civilian suicides, and desperate last stands showed the enduring grip of the death-before-surrender creed. But even in these hellish arenas, the pattern persisted. Wherever Japanese soldiers were captured alive, they were processed and treated in accordance with regulations. And wherever they received unexpected kindness, they spoke of it with awe. Each such episode chipped away at the myth of an implacable, subhuman FOEI in the American camps. The quiet routine of feeding prisoners and offering them cigarettes became an unheralded campaign of influence. Red Cross inspections, chaplains, and interpreters reinforced the image of a structured, humane system. Some prisoners even wrote letters home, allowed under supervision, describing their treatment. These letters, smuggled through war's censorship barriers, whispered to Japan that the empire's darkest warnings were false. And with each whisper, the psychological ground shifted a little more. The effect radiated outward. Allied propaganda leaflets dropped over Japanese positions increasingly cited the experiences of captured soldiers, quoting them about good treatment. Interrogators used these testimonies to persuade others to surrender. Pilots broadcast messages over loudspeakers, invoking the names of known captives. The image of Americans sharing beer and cigarettes with prisoners became part of a deliberate psychological operations campaign, a contrast to the kamikaze cult of self-destruction. Where Tokyo urged death, Washington offered a strange survival. For the Japanese, whose entire military ethos hinged on honor, such survival was deeply disorienting. In interviews years later, many admitted that the act of being treated as human by their captors made them question the moral universe in which they had been raised. Some described it as the first moment they felt the war was truly lost, not on the battlefield, but in the realization that the enemy had mastered not only weapons but also will. Thus, the strategic and psychological impact of American behavior in the Pacific cannot be overstated. It was not accidental charity, but part of a larger system, a system that saw morale, discipline, and logistics as intertwined weapons. Just as FM radios gave tactical agility and Hellcats gave mobility, humane treatment of POWs gave psychological leverage. Together, these elements formed a new kind of warfare, one where connection defeated isolation and abundance undermined fanaticism. As the war neared its end, this invisible front would play a decisive role in shaping both surrender and occupation. The Japanese soldiers who had once trembled at the sight of an American GI now looked at him with wary curiosity, even gratitude. The cigarettes they smoked and the beer they drank became emblems of an approaching future, a world in which survival, not death, defined honor. And as they sat in POW cages under tropical stars, they were living proof that a different kind of power had emerged in modern war, a power that could annihilate cities yet still extend a hand to its enemies, reshaping minds as surely as it reshaped battlefields in the stillness after the guns fell silent. The legacy of those quiet, humane gestures became clearer than any after-action report. By August 1945, as Japan lay in ruins and its armies capitulated, thousands of former prisoners held in American camps were repatriated. They returned not only with stories of war's destruction but also of an unexpected humanity shown by their captors. Tales of medics who treated wounds without discrimination, guards who shared cigarettes on sweltering afternoons, and officers who enforced order with discipline rather than cruelty. These stories were seeds. In a society taught that surrender meant dishonor and death, they germinated into something new, the idea that even amid total war, restraint and humanity were possible, and that the future might be built on cooperation rather than annihilation. Historians now see those acts as an overlooked pivot in the Pacific conflict. While B-29s and atomic bombs forced Japan's hand militarily, the steady, disciplined treatment of prisoners undercut the psychological foundation of the Imperial Army by showing captured soldiers a different path, survival. With dignity instead of death in despair, the Americans eroded the mythology of the Emperor's invincibility. This was not a soft war. It was psychological jujitsu, flipping the enemy's expectations and undermining the morale that had sustained years of fanatical defense. In the closing months of the war, surrender rates increased not just because defeat was inevitable, but because the captors had proven survivable. The effect resonated far beyond 1945. Many Japanese veterans who had been prisoners would later become advocates for reconciliation. Some would serve as translators, businessmen, or even political figures who championed U.S. Japan cooperation during the Cold War. They cited their POW experiences as the moment their worldview changed. In oral histories recorded decades later, former soldiers recalled tasting their first American cigarette as a moment of shock and transformation, a symbol of a world not governed by the zero-sum brutality they had been taught. This soft power, unplanned but consistent, smoothed the way for Japan's post-war pivot from adversary to ally. For the Americans, the legacy was equally instructive. Military planners took note of how logistics, communications, and humane discipline could combine to create strategic effects as powerful as any weapon. In Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts in the Middle East, echoes of the Pacific approach surfaced: psychological operations, civil affairs units, strict POW protocols, and an emphasis on winning hearts and minds alongside defeating enemy formations. Though inconsistently applied and often undermined by the brutal realities of later wars, the lesson of the Pacific was etched into doctrine. The understanding that the treatment of the defeated can shape the peace as much as victory itself. Technology and organization were central to this lesson. The same systems that allowed American divisions to coordinate artillery barges across miles of jungle also enabled them to house, feed, and process tens of thousands of prisoners in orderly fashion. Radios and supply chains, initially built for combat, became tools of humane management. This synergy presaged the network-centric approach to warfare that would dominate U.S. military thinking by the late 20th century. The idea that information, logistics, and morale form a single battle space. In that battle space, a cigarette or a cup of coffee can be as strategically potent as a tank round. There was also a cultural legacy. By enforcing standards of conduct even in the face of bitter fighting, the American military bolstered its own self-image as a force of rules and order. Soldiers who participated in prisoner care carried those memories home, shaping the veteran culture that would influence post-war America's moral narrative of the good war. For decades afterward, popular histories, memoirs, and documentaries would highlight not only the battles, but also the moments of compassion, gestures that complicated the black and white portrayal of World War II and hinted at a deeper struggle over values. Yet this legacy was not without its ironies. The same country that upheld humane treatment of Japanese POWs also unleashed unprecedented destruction on Japanese cities. Compassion and annihilation coexisted, revealing the dual nature of modern industrial war. But even within that paradox lay a lesson. A military machine powerful enough to destroy could also choose to restrain, and in doing so, wield influence that outlasted the battlefield. It showed future generations of strategists that psychological and moral dimensions of warfare could be as decisive as the kinetic ones. For Japan, the prisoners' memories became part of a national reckoning. As the nation rebuilt under American occupation, stories of fair treatment in POW camps softened civilian attitudes toward the occupiers. This subtle undercurrent helped General MacArthur's administration implement sweeping reforms with relatively little resistance. When Japan reemerged as a democratic ally, the narrative of humane treatment was woven into the fabric of post-war U.S. Japan relations, an unspoken counterweight to the trauma of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In classrooms and veterans' halls, the tale of beer and cigarettes passed quietly between generations, a small but potent counter-memory to the war's horrors. The broader historical lesson endures. In the age of drones, cyber warfare, and global surveillance, the fundamental dynamic glimpsed in those POW camps remains relevant. Connection outweighs isolation, and perception can defeat propaganda. Where the Imperial Army tried to bind its soldiers with fear of dishonor, the Americans dissolved that fear with a simple, disciplined demonstration of humanity. This was not sentimentality but strategy, a recognition that wars are fought in the mind as well as on the map. When we look back on World War II Pacific theater, beyond the iconic images of mushroom clouds and island assaults, another image emerges: a captured Japanese soldier, ragged and wounded, sitting under a palm tree while an American GI hands him a cigarette. It is a small moment, almost too minor for grand histories. Yet in that exchange lay a hint of the future. a world where former enemies could rebuild together, where an act of restraint could ripple across decades, reshaping alliances and altering the course of history. And in the narrator's voice, echoing across time, a final line might rise like a closing chord. In modern war, power is not only the ability to destroy, but the discipline to hold back. Not only the roar of engines and guns, but the quiet strength of an open hand. Beer and cigarettes were never just comforts. They were instruments of psychological warfare, emblems of a new kind of victory, one that endures not on the battlefield, but in the minds and memories of those who survive.